I've gotten to the point now in this lesson where I need to write code based on a condition, and that condition is which radio button did the user select? Because each one of those radio buttons is going to perform different code, and they're all currently using the same method. So what I mean by that is if we switch back quickly over to the activity main.xml and look at the graphical layout, I have 4 different radio buttons. Each one of those are calling the exact same method to execute. You can see that it's calling the onRadio group 1 click for each one of those. I need to be able to determine in code which one of those radio buttons was selected. So if I switch back over here to the main activity.java, I'm going to do that by creating a switch statement, which is going to evaluate each one of those clicks on a case-by-case situation to determine which one of those was selected. So let's go ahead and show you how to create that. I'm going to space down a little bit to give me a little bit more room to work with. And I start the switch statement by typing in the keyword switch. And now I need to create a condition to actually evaluate. In this case, I want to evaluate the ID of each one of those radio buttons to determine which one is different, because each one of those has a different ID value. So I'm going to go ahead and open in parenthesis, and in the parenthesis I'm going to go ahead and type in v, which is going to be for the view, dot get ID. And if I go ahead and double click that, you'll see that it loads up, and I just need to end this with an opening curly brace and hit enter, and that'll add an ending curly brace. Now you got to be careful because you're starting to see there's quite a few different curly braces available, and if I hover over that one or highlight that one, you'll see that this becomes highlighted as well. So this is going to be for the switch, this one is going to be for the method, and I'll just go ahead and space that one down just a little bit to give me some room to work with if I need to enter code in there. Now in the switch itself, I mentioned that it's going to be doing a case-by-case analysis of the ID of the view, which you see right here. And so when those radio buttons are being clicked, that view is being passed in, and I'm evaluating the ID of each one of those radio buttons. So now let's go ahead and set up our case. And as I mentioned before, I'm going to have multiple cases. In this case, I'm going to have 4 different cases because I have 4 different radio buttons. So I start off a case within the switch statement by using the keyword case. And then I'm going to go ahead and use the value that I'm going to evaluate to see if it matches the ID. In this case, it's going to be r.id.radio10. That'll be our first radio button. And the case statement ends in a colon, so I need to use a regular colon there and hit enter. And I'll go ahead and enter it twice. And I'm going to end that with a break. And I'll go ahead and use a semicolon. So the break is going to actually end the code. It doesn't use opening and closing curly braces like a lot of structures use. It actually uses the break command to break outside of this case. Go ahead and hit enter after the break. And we're going to go ahead and do a new case. So I'll type in case space, and then I'll do an r.id.radio, and this one was 15. So go ahead and double click that. Use a colon again. Hit enter twice, and then type in break with a semicolon after the break. And I'm going to go ahead and add in now the other 2 additional buttons. So let's go do a case r.id.radio20 colon, and I'll space down 2 and use break semicolon, and then the last one we're going to go ahead and use case r.id.radio, and this one was radio other, and then go ahead and use the colon, space down twice, and type in break with a semicolon. Now there's an additional keyword that we can use, and that's just the keyword default, which will create for us one more area in the event that none of these IDs are matched. And I'm not going to put one in this particular scenario because I only have 4 radio buttons, and so I will match up one of those 4 cases. But if there was another condition where it didn't match any of those, I can use the keyword default at the very end here and then write the code necessary for the catch-all event. And there is no break associated with that one. If you read through the text, you'll see that default used in an example. Okay, what I'm going to do now that the code is written, I have an area that will execute only when each one of these individual buttons are selected. So for instance, if radio 10 is selected, it will execute anything that I have in here, and only if radio 10 is selected. Same thing for radio 15 being in here, radio 20 being in here, and radio other being in here. If I switch back to my activity main.xml, I'm going to demonstrate this for you by disabling and enabling this edit text, which is going to allow them to type in the other amount. So when the 10%, 15%, and 20% is selected, I want the text box to be disabled, or the edit text to be disabled. And when the other is selected, I want this one to be enabled so that a user can type in a value. So let's go ahead and switch back over to our code, and I'll show you how I will do that. The name of that text box we went ahead and created was called ET_OTHER_TIP. That is the object that we're going to use within our code to reference the edit text other tip, which is that edit text we were just referring to. So now I'm going to go ahead and type in ET_OTHER_TIP dot, and I have quite a few different options that I can use here to modify or change the properties of our text box. So if I look for a method, actually I'll just keep typing set, and then now if I look after all the sets, I'm going to find one of them is enabled. Right here it is, and that's going to go ahead, and if I click on that once, I can see that it sets the enabled state of this view, and it makes it so that the edit text is either available to type in code or not type in code. So if it's true, the user can type in this case, numbers. If it's false, the text box will not be allowed to type in anything. So I'm coming back over here, and I'll just go ahead and finish this out. Enabled, and then inside of here I'm going to type in false and end that with a semicolon. So if radio 10 is selected, that edit text is going to be false, or will not be enabled. I'm going to go ahead and come over here to ET_OTHER_TIP.set enabled, and we're going to go ahead and do the same thing for radio 15. I'm just going to go ahead and copy that code, and I'll just paste it in here for radio 20. Now if I paste it in here again for radio other, I want this to actually be enabled when radio other is selected. So I'm going to come back over here and type in true. And if I come up all the way to the top, I'm going to notice that the radio button is going to start off by default being enabled, but if I come up to the onCreate method, I can go ahead and add a line of code that when the activity is created will automatically tell the system to disable the edit text. So I'll go ahead and put that in the onCreate there. So ET_OTHER_TIP will by default will be disabled. Let's go ahead and test our application to see this. I'll go ahead and save my changes. Okay, so now that the application is open, if I try to double click inside of this edit text, it is not going to let me. I'm going to go ahead and just type in a number. Let's say 34. 10% selected, 15% is selected. It still will not allow me to type anything in here. 20% is selected, still cannot type anything in here. Other is selected, and you'll notice that the edit text slightly changed. It will now allow me to type in another percentage. If I come back to 20%, you'll notice that it now becomes disabled. So depending on which option is selected, our switch statement will evaluate that and then determine whether or not it needs to be enabled or disabled. Okay, I'm going to switch back over here to our code, and that concludes the switch statement for this lesson.